didn't happen. But was Hiroshima the right thing to do? Nagasaki that followed, was it right? Can you justify the use of weapons like that? And do you still fear this now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the fact that they hold a massive stockpile of nuclear weapons that I think they can deliver accurately? Do you worry about the use of nuclear weapons now, or is it no longer in the consciousness? Probably two sides to this argument with our two guests. Lindsey German, convener of the Stop the War Coalition, is with me, and Professor Anthony Glees, also security expert from Buckingham University. Lindsey German, good morning to you.
Good morning.
78 years ago, and I remember so well the feelings in the late 70s and 80s when I was sort of young and studenty and thinking about these things, and it was a terrifying time. Do you still feel scared?
Well, I think we should all feel scared about the prospect of nuclear war. And I think one of the things that you quite rightly say is perhaps it's not so much in people's consciousness how terrible the effects of these wars are. I mean, you described the numbers. I mean, I think 140,000 dead in Hiroshima by the end of the year, the effects of radiation sickness, which killed many, many more people. And so I think, now we're talking about a world which is perhaps more dangerous than at any time, certainly since the Cuban Missile Crisis and probably since the end of the Second World War. And these are weapons which will destroy, one weapon would destroy the whole of central London, from King's Cross to Victoria. One of those would just do that. So these aren't things that people now talk very lightly. You can have tactical nuclear weapons, you can have all these sorts of things. But the truth of the matter is that if we're going towards nuclear war in any sense, it will mean mass death and destruction, and with terrible, terrible consequences.
Professor Anthony Glees, your view on Hiroshima from a historical perspective, and perhaps your view of the holding of nuclear weapons now?
Well, it's quite the reverse, Andrew. I mean, President Truman, who ordered the 2 bombs to be dropped on Japan, said famously he'd never lost a night's sleep over his decision. For the rest of his life, that was the case. And the truth is that the nuclear bombs or atomic bombs, we say, on Japan ended the Second World War very quickly. If the fighting had gone on, many, many hundreds of thousands of Americans would have been wounded and killed. The Japanese were fighting a suicidal battle, but they were fighting to kill as many Americans as they possibly could. And, over 100,000 young American men died trying to take the Japanese islands and of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and had the bomb not been dropped, the Japanese would have fought on. Yes, of course, atomic nuclear weapons are horrendous and horrible, but let me put another thought to you, that no nation that has possessed them has ever used them in anger. And it is their very horror that actually means they will never be used. The people who go for ban the bomb are actually saying, let's have more of the sort of war that we're seeing in Ukraine. If people get killed, whether it's by nuclear bombs or conventional weapons. The thing to do is to stop the war, and nuclear weapons have, on the whole, made the world a much safer place.
And
Lindsey,
can I respond to that? Because that simply isn't the case. The mayor of Hiroshima today has said that the whole notion that we've got nuclear deterrence is a fallacy. It's making the world more dangerous. But just to go back to 1945 for a minute, there is a great deal of historical evidence that Japan was preparing to surrender, and that America dropped the bombs because it wanted to show that it had that nuclear capacity, rather than that the war would have been ended anyway very, very quickly. So, Tokyo had already suffered very, very severe conventional bombing. These nuclear bombs were totally unnecessary as a means of ending the war. It was ending anyway. So I think that is a very fallacious argument. And I think we have to look at what's happened since. The truth is It's the major powers on the UN Security Council, by and large, are the countries that hold nuclear weapons, plus India and Pakistan. We only have to look at the instability in the world. Look at the instability in Pakistan over the arrest of Imran Khan. Look at the situation with Russia and Ukraine. The idea this won't happen, and actually,
well, it hasn't.
We've also got. Well, it hasn't happened. Well, hang on a minute.
It's the concept of mutually assured destruction and Anthony Glees would contend has meant that nuclear weapons haven't been deployed and used.
Well, firstly, they were deployed in 1945. Secondly, there are a whole number of other countries. Well, there's a whole number of other countries that are trying to develop nuclear weapons, as we know. And despite all the talk about non-proliferation, it's the case that a number of these are trying to do so with terrible consequences. We know that there has been the development of tactical nuclear weapons, so-called, which can be used on battlefields. Now, these are very dangerous things. And you mentioned Greenham Common and you mentioned protests about these things because people realised that wars involving these nuclear weapons would be wars which would be completely destructive. So I think we've got to look at a very different way of dealing with the questions of war and not about increasing the number of nuclear weapons.
Okay, Anthony.
Well, I'm afraid that's the views we've heard completely wrong. I quite understand that the mayor of Hiroshima should say, this is a terrible day, and indeed I'd agree with him. It is a terrible day.
No,
but I listen to you.
It was fallacious to the G7 countries to believe that they could deter through nuclear weapons, and that remains.
Let's just let Anthony. I'll come back to you.
We can't talk over each other.
Go ahead, Anthony.
And trying to silence people who disagree with you is a sign, in my opinion, of the weakness of your argument. It is a terrible thing. The use of nuclear weapons, Japan, was a terrible thing. But to those people like yourself who say they shouldn't have been used, you then have to say, you're willing for hundreds of thousands of young Americans, innocent young American lives to be taken in a fight to contain an appalling Japanese regime. And you come up with a story, a conspiracy theory that really America that Japan was ready to make peace with America, and America really wanted just to demonstrate it had nuclear weapons. There's no evidence for that at all. President Truman wanted. Please let me finish. President Truman wanted to stop the war, and the two bombs stopped the war. End of story. And when you come up to the Greenham Common people and the CND campaign, yes, these were people. My was a Greenham Common herself. I argued with her repeatedly about it. Yes, these were people who hated and loathed the idea of nuclear weapons, as do we all. But Greenham Common women helped the Soviet regime in its wish to increase the chances of nuclear war in Europe. They did not make peace in Europe. Peace came about because the Soviet Union disappeared because of its internal contradictions and our strength. And those countries who have nuclear weapons do not use them. And that is true even for that evil, demented man, Putin.
But Anthony, I'm going to let Lindsey come in now and respond, because she must be ready, I would have thought.
Well, I would just say, firstly, this is not a conspiracy theory about 1945. There is a lot of historical evidence that Japan was ready to surrender. If you look at the papers, the diplomatic papers at the time, if you look at the fact that Japan was by then clearly defeated, that the war in Europe had finished, if you look at all of those things. So it's not a conspiracy theory, and it's quite wrong to say that hundreds of thousands more people would have died if it hadn't continued. We're talking about 200,000 people died as a result of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki themselves. Now, maybe you're saying Japanese lives aren't worth as much as anybody else's lives, but I guess you're not saying that. So either way, we're talking about a terrible catastrophe. The fact is that the Greenham Common women succeeded in removing the cruise missiles from the base in Britain, and we didn't have those cruise missiles, and that was a big success because people recognised, and people still do recognise, that the drive to war is an absolutely destructive drive. The people of Ukraine are suffering as a result of that at the moment, and the people of Russia are suffering as a result of that at the moment. We do not want any more of that. And, you know, to just dismiss this as conspiracy theories, as people who, you know, somehow helped the Soviet Union, which would be news to the Green and Common women, is something which I think is just not taking this seriously.
Lindsey German, thank you. Convener of Stop the War Coalition there. A last word, 30 seconds, Professor Anthony Glees.
Well, nuclear weapons have kept the peace in the world in the sense that nuclear weapons have never been used again since 1945. That is amazing. To have sacrificed American lives against Japan would have been unthinkable. The Japanese regime was totally sadistic and cruel and would have fought to the last Japanese as well as the last American.
Okay, Professor Glees, Lindsey German, thank you very much indeed for getting the debate going. It's the 78th anniversary of one of the most terrible events in human history. It's the use of the atom bomb over Hiroshima. Some days later, Nagasaki suffered the same fate. So we look back now and we ask ourselves about the proliferation of nuclear weapons. They have not been used since. Does that mean that the clamour for nuclear weapons is perfectly understandable? 9 nations hold nuclear weapons at the moment. I mean, if you were a nation state, you would probably want to as well. Or if you were leading a nation state, you'd probably want that weapon as well, because it puts you at the top table, doesn't it? It's 0345 6060 973. 9:17 is the time. Thomas, what's with the news?
People who are wrongly convicted